Imagine discovering that the entire royal exit, the explosive Megxit saga that shook the monarchy, split global audiences, and redefined the future of the crown, wasn't actually a spontaneous act of liberation, but a premeditated strategy from the very beginning. Imagine hearing someone who knew Meghan Markle long before the fame, long before the tiaras, long before the titles, quietly say, "I saw it coming. She planned everything." Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Now here's the real shocker. That someone is her own father, and he is no longer staying silent. What if the story we were sold, the fairy tale romance, the oppressed duchess, the cruel crown, and the big escape, wasn't the whole truth? What if key decisions weren't driven by pressure and mistreatment, but opportunity and ambition? And what if Harry wasn't the one pulling Meghan away from the royal family, but Meghan was the one pushing Harry out, deliberately, strategically, relentlessly, because she believed he was worth more outside the monarchy than inside it? These aren't tabloids talking. This isn't palace speculation. This is what Thomas Markle is now publicly claiming. And the details he's revealing expose an entirely different reality behind Meghan's rise, her marriage, and ultimately, her break from the crown. The question is, why now? Why speak out at this moment, years after being shut out, years after being painted as the villain, years after Meghan and Harry started their new global empire in Montecito? And what does he know that the world wasn't supposed to hear? Because according to Thomas, the Megxit we all thought erupted overnight was actually years in the making. According to him, Meghan crafted a plan that positioned her and Harry as global free agents, celebrity influencers with royal roots, activists with Hollywood sparkle, victims with a platform, and all of it hinged on one thing: convincing Harry that leaving the royal family wasn't only necessary, but noble. And here's where things get uncomfortable. According to Thomas, Meghan didn't simply encourage Harry to stand up for himself. She didn't just support him through emotional turbulence. She didn't merely react to palace tensions. He says she pushed him hard, step by step, until there was no turning back, until independence became the only path. Imagine that, a duchess who believed her husband's royal status had more value outside the palace walls, more monetizable, more marketable, more useful, than within the centuries-old institution that shaped him from birth. Now ask yourself, is that liberation or strategy? Is that chemistry or calculation? Is that a love story or a power move? And is Thomas telling the truth or projecting his own pain? Because when a father reveals this kind of allegation about his own daughter, especially a father who has been painted as difficult, unreliable, and damaging, it forces everyone to question the narrative we've been fed. But here's the emotional twist. The man speaking now isn't just an angry parent. He's a father who believes he lost his daughter to fame, to influence, to a world he could never compete with. He's a father who regrets, a father who still hopes, a father who feels the world never heard his side, and a father who says he saw signs of this plan long before Harry ever entered the picture. But that's only the surface, because Thomas claims Meghan's vision of independence began years earlier. During her Hollywood climb, during her Suits years, during her intense drive for recognition, during her obsession with branding. He says the royal wedding wasn't the beginning of a new life. It was the perfect opportunity. The global spotlight, the ultimate platform, and the palace? An institution that would never be enough for her. Never flexible enough. Never modern enough. Never profitable enough. Do you see the twist forming? Because if Thomas is right, then the story of the Sussexes leaving the royal family wasn't born out of pressure from the press or racism or alienation. It wasn't the result of the monarchy rejecting Meghan. It wasn't even the culmination of personal trauma. It was the execution of a long-term plan. A plan she crafted. A plan she initiated. A plan she convinced Harry to follow. But we need to ask an uncomfortable question. Is Thomas Markle a reliable narrator? Is he an insider? Or an outsider peering in through blurry windows of assumption and pain? Because the world knows the Markle family has drama. But there's something different about what Thomas is saying now. This isn't the typical father-daughter feud the media loves to sensationalize. These new claims are more strategic, more revealing, more cutting, and more detailed. He's describing the evolution of Meghan's mindset, the shift in her behavior, the changes he saw in real time, and the pattern he believes she repeated with Harry. Pattern. That's the key word. According to Thomas, Meghan operates in patterns, social patterns, relationship patterns, ambition patterns. And in his eyes, Harry wasn't the exception. He was the culmination. Now pause. Ask yourself, why would a father go this far? Why expose his daughter so publicly? Why risk backlash, ridicule, and further alienation? Because Thomas says this isn't about revenge. This isn't about money. This isn't about humiliation. He says it's about truth, a truth he's carried for years, a truth that paints Meghan not as a victim trapped by royal protocol, but as an architect designing an exit strategy long before she said, "I do." Let that sink in. A royal wedding as step 1. A global rebrand as step 2. A public emotional reset as step 3. And then the ultimate pivot. Harry, liberated from royal duty, ready to build a Hollywood-influenced empire. The Netflix deals, the Spotify contracts, the docuseries, the memoir, the brand partnerships, the Archwell machine. Were these all spontaneous opportunities? Or were they the natural outcomes of a bigger plan? Thomas suggests the latter. He says the pieces were already in play. He says Meghan studied influence, fame, brand value, and emotional leverage long before she reached Buckingham Palace. He says she understood the market for royal rebels. And he says Harry was the missing piece, the prince who made the strategy unstoppable. Do you feel the tension rising? Because now we're entering the uncomfortable territory where personal ambition meets public duty, where marriage meets monarchy, where emotion meets strategy. The world saw Meghan and Harry's exit as an act of courage, a couple choosing freedom over institution, love over protocol, possibility over tradition. Millions cheered. Millions empathized. Millions felt they were watching history modernize itself in real time. But Thomas argues the opposite. He says history didn't change. He says Meghan changed the game. He says she redefined what it means to marry into royalty, not as a lifetime commitment, but as a lifetime opportunity. Now, to be clear, this isn't about hating Meghan. This isn't about villainizing her. This isn't about doubting her success, her intelligence, or her resilience. She is, undeniably, one of the most compelling public figures of our time. But when your own father says your rise wasn't a fairy tale, but a formula, that forces everyone to reconsider the story. Because according to him, Meghan saw something the world didn't. Harry wasn't just a prince. He was a brand. He was leverage. He was the gateway to a celebrity royal hybrid empire the world had never seen before. And she recognized his value long before he realized his own power outside the monarchy. But what does that mean for the royal family? For Harry himself? For the future of the Sussex brand? For the broken Markle family dynamic? And here's the million-dollar question. Did Meghan really pressure Harry? Or did Harry willingly step into the new identity she presented him? That's where this story shifts. That's where viewpoints clash. That's where emotions explode. Because if Thomas is right, then Meghan didn't just encourage Harry to distance himself from the monarchy. She orchestrated it. And yet, there's a twist Thomas doesn't fully explain. A piece of the puzzle he hints at, but doesn't reveal right away. A moment he says proves his entire theory. A moment involving Meghan, a private comment, and a prediction she made long before the world knew what was coming. What if the very first warning sign didn't come from the palace, the press, or even the royal family, but from a quiet car ride in California, years before the world ever linked Meghan Markle and Prince Harry together? What if the seeds of the royal exit, the very mentality that would later pull a prince out of his ancestral institution, were already forming long before their relationship even began? And what if Thomas Markle, sitting in the driver's seat with his daughter beside him, noticed something that didn't feel like a quirk, or an ambition, or a goal, but a pattern, a shift, a hunger, a spark that hinted at something far more calculated than anyone realized at the time? This is where the story truly begins, not in Kensington Palace, not at Windsor Castle, not on the steps of St. George's Chapel, but in a small, ordinary moment that Thomas claims exposed something extraordinary. The first crack. The quiet beginning of a mindset that would one day shake the monarchy itself. Because according to Thomas, Meghan had a certain way of talking about power, success, and attention, a way that seemed harmless at first, even admirable, but slowly began to reveal a deeper pattern. a pattern of wanting more, reaching higher, seeing life as a ladder where every rung was temporary. A pattern he says he recognized early on, long before she ever imagined herself standing next to a prince. But here's the disturbing part. Thomas says he didn't realize how serious those patterns were until it was too late. He remembers moments, conversations, reactions, small comments, where Meghan spoke about fame not like someone enjoying it, but like someone studying it. Where she spoke about relationships, not like someone searching for love, but like someone navigating opportunity. Where she spoke about her future not like someone dreaming, but like someone mapping. And according to him, the Meghan the world sees today, the global figure with a multi-million-dollar brand, a Netflix deal, a PR machine, a carefully curated public image, is the same Meghan he saw emerging in small flashes years earlier. But back then, it was easy to brush aside, easy to ignore, easy to view as ambition, confidence, determination. After all, she was a hard-working actress trying to make it. Who wouldn't be strategic? But Thomas says there was something more. A sharpness behind the smile, a calculation behind the charm, a forward-thinking mindset that didn't just dream about success, but hunted it. And he claims the very early signs of that mindset showed up in moments the world never paid attention to. Like that car ride. He says Meghan was scrolling through her phone, as she often did, looking at the newest updates from Suits, fan reactions, celebrity gossip, the rising attention she was beginning to receive. She wasn't overwhelmed. She wasn't intimidated. She wasn't shy about it. She was analyzing it. She was studying what kinds of posts got attention, which public figures were rising fastest, which interviews landed best, which narratives people responded to. According to Thomas, she once said something that stuck with him for years. You just need the right story, the right moment, the right person next to you. He remembers laughing it off. He didn't think she meant anything by it. He didn't think she was laying out a philosophy. He thought it was just conversation. But after Megxit, he couldn't stop replaying that one line. What did she mean by the right person next to you? Why did she say it so casually? And why did it become more meaningful with every new revelation that emerged after her royal exit? This is where Thomas's early warnings begin. Not with scandal, not with arguments, not with a dramatic betrayal, but with subtle moments that only gained significance in hindsight. He recalls Meghan's growing fascination with influence. Not fame, influence. The difference matters. Fame is loud. Influence is strategic. Fame is messy. Influence is managed. Fame is accidental. Influence is earned or engineered. According to him, Meghan wasn't obsessed with being seen. She was obsessed with being heard, being known, being recognizable on her own terms. She wanted the kind of influence that wasn't tied to a role, a studio, or a TV show. She wanted influence that traveled, influence that expanded, influence that couldn't be taken away with a canceled season or a role being recast. And Thomas says the way she talked about breaking out, going bigger, and finding the next level was different from most aspiring actors he knew. There was a controlled intensity, a certainty, a quiet ambition that didn't fade even when she achieved success. In fact, it grew. But here's where things get interesting. Thomas claims that Meghan had another pattern. She didn't just analyze opportunities. She analyzed people. He describes how she studied personalities, especially powerful ones. How she could read someone's insecurities before they ever realized they'd revealed them. How she knew how to soothe, how to excite, how to motivate, how to shift conversations in her favor with grace and subtlety. He says Meghan had a way of making people feel seen, but also a way of making them feel dependent on her approval. This isn't uncommon among ambitious people. But Thomas suggests Meghan's approach was different, more precise, more intentional, more guided by what he calls her emotional intelligence radar. He remembers times when Meghan befriended people quickly, intensely, only to drift away once she had moved on to something else. Not out of cruelty, but out of evolution. There was always a next step with Meghan, he says. Always something ahead. She never stayed in one place emotionally. She was always growing or outgrowing. He says she didn't cling to relationships. She upgraded them. In hindsight, he believes this pattern, the ability to form quick bonds but detach when necessary, played a major role in how she navigated the royal family. But he didn't see the full picture then. Not yet. Not until she reached a different phase of her life. The Suits years, where her visibility skyrocketed and her circle evolved rapidly. Thomas recalls a moment when Meghan told him she wanted a platform, not just a career, a platform. At the time, he assumed she meant the ability to speak out about causes, charities, or social issues she cared about. But he now thinks she meant something larger, much larger. Because according to Thomas, the Meghan who dreamed of a platform didn't simply want the spotlight. She wanted the power to shape narratives, to guide conversations, to influence culture. And the day she met Harry, Thomas believes she felt something shift, not just emotionally, but strategically. But let's not jump ahead. We're still in the early days, when Thomas was simply noticing subtle changes, small clues, and quiet ambitions that didn't seem alarming then, but now feel like the first cracks in a story the world thought it understood. One of the most telling moments came when Meghan casually mentioned, over dinner, that marrying into prominence, not necessarily royalty, but prominence, opens doors you could never open alone. Again, Thomas dismissed it. He thought she meant it in the general, philosophical sense. He didn't think she was foreshadowing anything. But years later, when she married Harry and became one of the most photographed women on the planet overnight, he replayed that line again and again. Opens doors you could never open alone. What did that mean in her mind? What kinds of doors was she thinking about? What ambitions were forming at that moment? Thomas says the first crack, the first early warning, wasn't a single event. It was a pattern of conversations, a pattern of goals, a pattern of comments that all revealed one underlying truth. Meghan didn't just believe she was destined for more. She believed she was meant to operate on a world stage. And when Harry came into the picture, Thomas says those ambitions aligned in a way that was almost too perfect. But before that alignment, before the fairy tale, before the controversy, before the exit, there was one moment that Thomas says still haunts him. A moment he describes as the turning key. A moment that made him realize Meghan's rise would not be simple and not be without casualties. It happened shortly after Meghan's fame began to grow, when she told him something that didn't feel ominous then, but feels prophetic now. She supposedly looked at him, calmly, confidently, and said, "The world is bigger than the people you leave behind." At the time, he didn't know what she meant. He still questions if he interpreted it correctly. But he says that line represents everything that came afterward. The distance, the silence, the cut ties, the new life, the new identity, the royal exit. Because if Thomas is right, that one sentence wasn't about ambition. It was about evolution. And if Meghan truly believed that the world is bigger than the people you leave behind, then Harry's departure from the royal family wasn't emotional or accidental or reactive. It was inevitable. What if the royal wedding wasn't the beginning of Meghan Markle's transformation, but the halfway point of a plan she'd already been crafting for years? What if the palace wasn't the foundation of her new life, but merely a beautifully decorated bridge she always intended to cross on her way to something much larger? And what if the real shock isn't that she left the royal family, but that she may have never truly intended to stay? Those are the questions that surface when you listen closely to Thomas Markle's new claims. Questions that force you to rewind the story long before Harry entered the picture. Questions that push you back into Meghan's formative years. The years where she wasn't Duchess Meghan, but ambitious actress Meghan, determined journalist Meghan, rising brand Meghan. Because if you follow Thomas's version of events, everything Meghan did after marrying Harry makes a strange kind of sense. Once you look at who she was long before she said, "I do." The world loves to imagine that Meghan's independence began when the palace rejected her, when the tabloids attacked her, when the pressure became unbearable, when she and Harry fled to California for freedom and peace. But Thomas argues that independence wasn't a reaction. It was a blueprint, something she built long before she met the prince, something she polished through experience, something she returned to again and again, like a map she kept tucked away until the timing was perfect. According to him, Meghan always believed she was meant for a life bigger than the one she was handed, not in a superficial, celebrity-chasing way, but in a strategic, world-shaping way. She didn't want to be famous. She wanted to be relevant. And relevance, real relevance, requires independence. Thomas remembers the early days of her acting career, when he would drive her to auditions, and she would sit in the passenger seat rehearsing lines with a confidence that didn't match the uncertainty of her circumstances. She wasn't famous yet. She wasn't rich. She wasn't established. She was just another actress in Los Angeles hoping for a break. But Thomas says there was something different about her even then. A kind of certainty. A fierce belief that her life had a trajectory most people couldn't see. Not even him. He recalls her saying once, after losing a role she desperately wanted, "It's fine. My door isn't here. My door will come from someplace no one expects." That stuck with him for years. Because Meghan didn't speak like an underdog. She spoke like someone who believed the universe owed her a major pivot point. And she was willing to keep moving until she found it. And once she landed Suits, Thomas noticed the first signs of what he now calls her independence mindset. She didn't see Suits as a destination. She saw it as leverage. The show gave her visibility. Visibility gave her access. Access gave her options. And options were everything to Meghan. Thomas claims Meghan talked openly about using Suits as a launchpad, a word he says she repeated often. She loved the cast, she loved the work, she loved the spotlight, but she saw it as a chapter, not a career. She wanted to expand, to write, to produce, to influence culture, to attach her name to causes, ideas, conversations that traveled beyond the TV screen. But here's where things get interesting. According to Thomas, Meghan didn't just want to be part of the conversation, she wanted to shape it. She wanted to guide narratives, not respond to them. She wanted to speak as an authority, not a participant. Influencers post, leaders direct. Meghan wanted to lead. He remembers a moment that, looking back, feels almost prophetic. Meghan was invited to attend a charity event, not as a speaker, not as a headliner, but simply as a guest. Yet she approached it like a CEO preparing for a product launch. She discussed what to wear, what to say if interviewed, how to present herself, what photos would resonate, and what message she wanted to convey if the opportunity arose. Thomas remembers thinking, she's not attending, she's strategizing. Her ability to craft narratives, long before she had a global stage, impressed him, even if he didn't fully understand what it meant at the time. But the clue was there. Meghan didn't wait for opportunities to define her. She defined herself around the opportunities. And this is where the blueprint begins to form. Even in her early 30s, long before Prince Harry, Thomas says Meghan had a consistent pattern. She would step into a new chapter of life with enthusiasm, master it, and then outgrow it. Not because she was ungrateful, not because she was restless, but because she always had her eyes on a higher horizon. This wasn't impulsiveness. It was movement, calculated movement. Thomas claims Meghan kept journals filled with goals, vision statements, future plans, and strategies for expansion. She wrote about growing her influence, creating a global platform, building something that would outlast her acting career. It sounded ambitious, even grandiose at times, but Thomas says it didn't feel unrealistic when she spoke about it, because she spoke about it so convincingly. The pivotal question, then, is simple. How does a woman with global ambitions, strategic thinking, and a desire for influence react when she enters one of the most powerful, restrictive institutions in the world? Thomas believes the royal family was never the final destination. It was a stage, a platform, a bridge, and perhaps the most painful part of all is that he doesn't believe Meghan intended to stay on that bridge for long. He recalls a conversation shortly after Meghan got the call that Prince Harry was interested in her. She was excited, intrigued, flattered, but she wasn't swept off her feet in the fairy tale way the world imagines. Instead, she analyzed the situation. She asked questions, lots of them. How does royal life work? How does the media operate around the monarchy? How much freedom do they have? How much control do they have? Could she continue her activism? Would she be silenced? Would she be supported? What would she gain, and what would she lose? Thomas said she treated the idea like an opportunity to be studied, not just a love story to fall into. And here's the detail that still unsettles him. He remembers Meghan asking what he thought about the global impact such a relationship could have. Not the romantic impact, not the emotional impact, the global impact. And in that moment, Thomas says he saw a shift in her, a spark he hadn't seen before, a spark that looked like recognition, not of Harry, not of romance, but of alignment. Because Prince Harry wasn't just a partner. He was a platform, a new level, A global pivot point that aligned with everything she'd been dreaming, planning, and writing for years. Thomas insists he's not saying Meghan didn't love Harry. He believes she did, and does. But love and ambition aren't mutually exclusive. Sometimes they walk hand in hand. Sometimes ambition is the lens through which love is interpreted. Sometimes ambition shapes the decisions love inspires. And this is where Thomas's early concerns began to form. He says Meghan began speaking differently after meeting Harry. Her language shifted. Her goals expanded. Her timeline accelerated. She talked about legacy, about global reach, about impact on a scale most people never get to experience. That phrase, impact on a scale most people never get to experience, stuck with him. Meghan had always been confident. But this was different. This was certainty. Thomas recalls a moment when Meghan told him she didn't want to be just another actress. She wanted to be iconic. And the royal family? It offered that possibility instantly. The power of a duchess. The attention of the world. The symbolism of modern royalty. But here's what Thomas says changed everything. When Meghan realized that royal influence came with restrictions she couldn't control, she began imagining an alternative. A hybrid identity. Royal prestige without royal limits. Global influence without protocol. Celebrity freedom with royal branding. She didn't share these thoughts openly at first, not with the world, and not even with him. But Thomas claims he saw her mind turning. He saw her measuring the pros and cons. He saw the calculations behind her eyes. Meghan wasn't dreaming about tiaras. She was thinking about transformation. He says her questions became sharper over time. Do they own your voice? Do they control your image? Can you speak freely? What happens if you disagree with something? What if you want to expand your career? These aren't the questions of someone preparing to surrender themselves to a lifetime of royal service. These are the questions of someone preparing to navigate around obstacles, to find loopholes, to maintain autonomy, to hold on to the independence that had defined her entire adult life. And the biggest question she asked Thomas, the one he says he will never forget, was this. Do you think someone can change the system from the inside? At the time, he thought she meant activism. He thought she wanted to modernize tradition. He thought she wanted to push the monarchy toward a more inclusive, progressive future. But looking back now, he realizes she may have meant something else. Something far bigger. Something far more disruptive. Because if she believed she couldn't change the system from the inside, then the only alternative was to step outside. But not empty-handed. With influence. With branding. With global sympathy. With a narrative. And Harry? He was the key to that narrative. Thomas claims the blueprint for independence didn't begin with royal drama. It began with Meghan's lifelong pattern of building platforms, and then outgrowing them. The palace, in his eyes, was always destined to become another platform she would eventually outgrow. Not because she was ungrateful, but because she believed her reach could be bigger outside its walls. And when the royal family didn't bend to her pace, her methods, or her vision, independence became the only path that aligned with who she had always been. The royal wedding wasn't the fairy tale beginning. It was the perfect launch. But Thomas says the moment he realized this most clearly was a private comment Meghan made before the engagement was announced. A comment he didn't understand then, but now considers the clearest sign of all. She supposedly said, I can make a bigger difference if I'm not limited. Not limited by what? Tradition? Protocol? Duty? Or something else entirely? This question changed the direction of everything. Because that mindset, that belief, would one day form the backbone of Harry and Meghan's departure from the royal family. But the moment that truly cemented Thomas's suspicion, the moment that made him believe Meghan's blueprint was real, was something he says happened after their engagement, during an emotional conversation he never expected. A moment that revealed her biggest fear and her biggest ambition. A moment that hinted at a master plan no one else saw taking shape. What if the real power behind the royal exit didn't come from Meghan's ambition alone, but from her ability to understand Prince Harry in ways no one inside the royal family ever could? What if the shock of Megxit, the sudden, seismic rupture that shook the monarchy, wasn't simply a clash of values or cultures or personalities, but a collision between Harry's deepest emotional wounds and Meghan's intuitive ability to navigate them? That's the uncomfortable question Thomas Markle raises when he describes the dynamics he believes defined their relationship from early on. Because, according to him, Meghan didn't just fall in love with Harry, she understood him. Completely. Instinctively. Strategically. And Harry, for the first time in his life, felt seen. Not as a prince. Not as a royal duty. Not as an institution. But as a human being carrying decades of unspoken pain. The mother he lost. The mistrust he developed. The pressures he inherited. The expectations he never asked for. The trauma he never healed from. Thomas believes these emotional cracks, the cracks Harry spent years trying to hide under protocol, military discipline, and royal expectations, were the very spaces Meghan learned to fill. And once she did, she had access to a part of him no one else had ever reached. But let's step back for a moment. To understand Meghan's influence over Harry and why Thomas insists it played a crucial role in the royal exit, you have to understand Harry before Meghan. Not the polished public figure. Not the uniformed soldier. Not the rebellious prince. The wounded child. The angry young man. The grieving soul who never fully recovered from watching the world consume his mother's memory while criticizing him for every mistake he made afterward. Harry entered adulthood carrying a storm that never fully quieted. Thomas says Meghan recognized that storm instantly, and she stepped into it with a kind of emotional fluency that Harry had never experienced. But here's where Thomas introduces the first major contradiction of this chapter. He doesn't say Meghan manipulated Harry. He doesn't claim she targeted his wounds. He doesn't label her intentions as malicious. He describes something far more complex and far more dangerous. He says Meghan became exactly what Harry needed at exactly the moment he needed it. Supportive, empowering, affectionate, attentive, listening in ways no royal ever had, understanding him in ways his family didn't, encouraging him in ways the palace couldn't. And when you offer someone drowning a lifeline, especially someone who has felt alone for most of their life, they cling to it with their whole being. This was the foundation of Meghan's influence, according to Thomas. Not manipulation, alignment, emotional resonance, connection. And connection is powerful, more powerful than tradition, more powerful than hierarchy, more powerful than the crown. Thomas says this emotional bond between Harry and Meghan deepened faster than anyone realized. Most relationships build slowly. This one ignited. Because Harry wasn't just dating an actress. He was finding a new identity, a new narrative, a new set of beliefs about what his life could be. And Meghan, according to Thomas, guided him through that transformation. Thomas remembers the first time he sensed how deeply Meghan understood Harry. It wasn't in grand gestures. It wasn't in royal news. It wasn't in public appearances. It was in the way Meghan described Harry's frustrations she claimed he had carried for years. She spoke about his resentment toward the press, his complicated relationship with duty, his feeling of always being overshadowed, his sense of never being fully protected, his memory of watching Princess Diana suffer under the same pressures he was expected to endure. Thomas says Meghan understood Harry's triggers and traumas so well, it startled him. "How do you know this?" he asked her. She shrugged. "I listen." But Thomas began to notice something else. Meghan didn't just listen. She reframed things. She gave Harry's pain context. She validated his emotions. She amplified the injustices he felt. She echoed the frustrations he had never fully voiced. According to Thomas, this formed the basis of their most powerful dynamic. Harry felt heard. Meghan felt aligned. But alignment can become powerful enough to reshape a life. Thomas describes moments when Meghan began speaking about Harry's pain using language that didn't sound purely supportive, but directional. It's not healthy for him there. He needs space from that world. You don't heal in the place that hurt you. He deserves a life where he feels free. He shouldn't be controlled. She didn't say he should leave the royal family. Not yet. Not directly. But Thomas believes she planted seeds that matched Harry's deepest internal fears and desires. And Harry, who had spent years feeling constrained, criticized, and cornered, began to see Meghan as the person who understood him best, maybe even more than he understood himself. But here's the twist Thomas never expected. The more Meghan aligned with Harry's emotional wounds, the more Harry aligned with Meghan's worldview. He began echoing her frustrations, repeating her criticisms, seeing the monarchy through her lens. And Thomas says this is when he realized something had shifted. Not just in Meghan, but in Harry. Harry's language changed. His tone changed. His posture changed. He began talking about freedom in a way he never had before. He began talking about finding his own voice. He began questioning the system that raised him. He began distancing himself emotionally from William, Charles, and the institution itself. Thomas describes this as the moment when Meghan's influence became undeniable, not because she controlled Harry, but because she awakened a version of him the royal family wasn't prepared for. Harry began to see himself not as a prince bound by duty, but as a man with a choice, a man who deserved happiness, a man who was allowed to walk away, a man who didn't have to live in the shadow of tragedy for the rest of his life, and who offered that vision of a new life. Meghan. But here's the darker layer Thomas hints at. Did Meghan believe in Harry's freedom for his sake? Or because his freedom aligned with her own blueprint? Did she encourage him to step into power, or encourage him to step away from a system she could never fully control? Thomas doesn't accuse. He questions. He raises possibilities. He challenges the narrative that Meghan was simply reacting to the pressures of royal life. He suggests Meghan may have recognized Harry's vulnerabilities, not to exploit them, but to bond with them. And once she bonded with them, she realized something. If Harry stayed in the royal family, her influence would always be limited. If Harry left, her influence could expand infinitely. This is the point where Thomas's perspective becomes sharp, not bitter, not sensational, but observant. He says Meghan's emotional intelligence gave her a rare power over Harry, the power to awaken the parts of him that felt unheard, unseen, and undervalued within the monarchy. And Harry, who craved emotional safety, gravitated toward the person who made him feel whole. But here's where the story becomes dangerous. Because emotional alignment, when combined with ambition, becomes fuel. Fuel for change. Fuel for rebellion. Fuel for reinvention. Thomas says the moment he realized the full depth of Meghan's influence wasn't during the wedding, or the media battles, or the royal exit. It was a single moment. A conversation he overheard after a tense incident involving the palace, when Meghan comforted Harry. She told him quietly, "You don't have to live like this. You don't owe them your happiness." That was it. Not dramatic, not angry, not rebellious. Just simple, soft, calm, certain. And Thomas says Harry looked at her as if hearing the truth for the first time. That moment, he believes, was the beginning of the end. Because once someone believes they don't owe a system their happiness, walking away becomes the obvious next step. But the moment that followed, the moment Thomas says proved everything he had suspected about Meghan's influence, was far more shocking, far more emotional, and far more final. A moment that would change Harry's path forever. What if the split between Prince Harry and the royal family didn't erupt in a single dramatic moment, but unfolded slowly, quietly, almost invisibly at first? What if the world's biggest royal rift, the one that eventually exploded into Megxit, actually began as a series of tiny misunderstandings, subtle tensions, unspoken resentments, and small emotional shifts that compounded until the break became inevitable? And what if Meghan, according to Thomas Markle, wasn't simply swept into the turbulence, but became a powerful accelerant of it? This is where the story turns from emotional alignment to structural fracture. Because the difference between a couple struggling privately and a couple poised to leave one of the world's oldest institutions is the moment subtle tension becomes undeniable conflict. Thomas argues that the rift began far earlier than the public believes, not during the explosive interviews, not during the wedding drama, not during the feud narratives, but in the quiet early months of Harry and Meghan's relationship, when emotional pressure first began colliding with royal tradition. He describes this stage as the moment the simmer began. Not boiling, not explosive, just simmering. A low, slow heat building underneath every interaction, every conversation, every expectation placed on the couple. But he claims Meghan didn't just step into that simmer. She reacted to it in ways that changed Harry's perspective from the inside out. To understand how the rift truly began, you must imagine Harry's world at this time. He was still the spare, still bound by duty, still expected to follow the script laid out for him since birth. His brother William was heir to the throne, dignified, polished, responsible. Harry, meanwhile, was searching for meaning beyond tradition. And here's the contradiction that makes this chapter so revealing. Harry had been questioning the monarchy for years, long before Meghan arrived. He had doubts. He had frustrations. He had emotional scars tied to the institution. Meghan didn't create Harry's rebellion. She magnified it. She validated it. She intensified it. According to Thomas, this is where her influence became most visible, not in what she told Harry to do, but in how she reacted to situations Harry had long struggled with. Take, for example, the protocols, the layers of rules, the structure, the press obligations, the constant criticism, the inability to respond, the suppression of personal opinions, the tight control over public image. Harry had resented these for years. But with Meghan, those frustrations suddenly had a witness, someone who wasn't conditioned to just accept it, someone who questioned it, someone who challenged the very foundation of it. Thomas says Meghan pushed back against royal restrictions in ways no one had done around Harry before. She questioned the logic. She questioned the necessity. She questioned the fairness. And Harry, who had grown up in that system without ever having the language to critique it, suddenly felt empowered. Thomas believes this empowerment was the first real spark of the rift. But the moment the simmer became noticeable wasn't when Meghan challenged the monarchy. It was when Harry began doing it with her. He started speaking differently. He started asking questions he'd never asked out loud. He started wondering what life outside the institution might look like. He started imagining freedom. And once that door opened, it could never be fully closed again. Thomas recalls one pivotal moment, a moment that didn't make headlines, didn't leak, didn't show up in memoirs, but speaks volumes about how the rift evolved. He heard that Meghan and Harry attended a small, private family gathering. Not a formal event, not a major milestone, just a quiet evening with royals and insiders. There, according to Thomas, something small happened. A simple protocol correction. Something minor, the kind of gentle reminder royals hear all the time. A suggestion to stand a certain way, to address someone with a specific title, to wait before speaking, to follow the hierarchy. To most royals, this is routine. To Meghan, Thomas says, it felt restrictive. He claims she expressed her frustration to Harry afterward. Not in an explosive rant, but in a measured, calm statement that hit him deeply. I'm a grown woman. I shouldn't have to be managed. That phrase became central to what Thomas believes fueled the growing divide. Harry had always felt managed. He had always felt controlled. He had always felt confined. But hearing Meghan express the same discomfort, with clarity, with confidence, with defiance, made him feel less alone. This is where the rift deepened. Because Meghan didn't just challenge the system. She gave Harry permission to challenge it too. According to Thomas, this is where subtle manipulation becomes a matter of interpretation. Some say she empowered him. Some say she validated him. Others say she pushed him. Thomas falls into the last category. He believes Meghan's criticisms, even when justified, landed in Harry's heart like fuel for a rebellion that had been waiting decades to ignite. But the rift wasn't yet visible to the public. It was internal, quiet, private, and the people who saw first signs weren't journalists or royal aides. It was those closest to Harry, particularly William. This chapter cannot be told without addressing the rising tension between the brothers, tension that Thomas believes Meghan accelerated, even if unintentionally. According to insiders, and echoed by Thomas, William urged caution early on, not because he disliked Meghan, not because he was jealous, but because he feared the pace. William had always moved slowly, thoughtfully, traditionally. Harry, however, had found someone who encouraged the opposite. Freedom, independence, acceleration, innovation, emotion over protocol. This created an emotional collision between the brothers. William feared Harry was being swept away. Harry felt William was being controlling. Meghan felt misunderstood and judged, and the palace felt overwhelmed by the rapid shift in dynamics. This tension, subtle at first, began eroding the foundation of trust between Harry and the institution. Thomas describes it as a widening crack no one could repair. But here's the most crucial detail. Meghan didn't cause the crack. She illuminated it. She made Harry see something he had spent years avoiding, that his relationship with duty had always been fragile, and his relationship with his family was built on expectations, not emotional understanding. And once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. Thomas says Meghan's presence highlighted every contradiction in Harry's life. He wanted freedom, but was bound by protocol. He wanted love, but was controlled by tradition. He wanted identity, but was defined by hierarchy. He wanted purpose, but was trapped in roles. He wanted a voice, but was silenced at every turn. Meghan didn't silence him. She amplified him. And the royal family wasn't prepared for Harry 2.0. This is where the tension grew from simmer to friction. According to Thomas, Harry began questioning everything more openly. Why couldn't he protect Meghan from the press? Why couldn't he speak out when he saw unfair coverage? Why couldn't he set boundaries with the monarchy? Why couldn't he have a life that felt authentically his? And Meghan's answers, sharp, direct, emotionally charged, started influencing Harry's worldview. She allegedly told him, "You don't have to tolerate what hurts you just because it's tradition." That sentence, Thomas claims, was a turning point. Because Harry had always endured the monarchy, he had never questioned whether he was allowed to walk away from it. But the real turning moment, the one Thomas now points to as the catalyst for everything that followed, was far more intimate. He says he heard from someone close to Meghan that she once asked Harry quietly, in a moment of emotional vulnerability, "Are you staying because you want to, or because you're afraid to leave?" And that question, Thomas believes, changed Harry forever. Because once you ask yourself whether you're free, you've already started planning your escape. But the moment that followed, the moment that set the stage for the royal explosion, wasn't about Meghan's ambition or Harry's wounds. It was a private argument inside the royal family itself. An argument Thomas says exposed exactly how fragile everything had become. What if the real breaking point in the Sussex saga wasn't a single explosive feud, a dramatic betrayal, or a hostile press headline, but something far quieter, far more personal, and far more corrosive? What if the true origin of Megxit began not with a public scandal, but behind closed doors, in the private moments where Meghan Markle realized, slowly, painfully, that royal life wasn't just structured, it was suffocating? And what if, according to Thomas Markle, this suffocation didn't just frustrate Meghan, it fundamentally reshaped her relationship with the monarchy, with herself, and ultimately with Harry? Because this chapter isn't about the headlines the world already knows. It's not about Tiaragate, bridesmaid drama, or the infamous Rift narratives. This chapter dives beneath all that, into Meghan's internal world, the emotional unraveling that Thomas believes pushed her toward resentment, rebellion, and eventually, strategic escape. But the most staggering part of all is this. Thomas says the seeds of Meghan's resentment didn't begin after the wedding. They began the moment she stepped into royal life and realized independence was no longer hers to control. Let's begin with the mini-hook question that sets the tone for everything that follows. What happens when a woman who has built her entire adult life on autonomy enters a system designed to strip autonomy away? Thomas says Meghan's reaction was immediate, quiet at first, but unmistakable. Confusion, shock, then growing tension. Because no matter how glamorous the palace appears from afar, the internal experience is something entirely different. Imagine being a 30-something woman who has run her own life, created her own identity, traveled alone, built a brand, worked her way up in Hollywood, negotiated contracts, shaped a public image, and advocated for herself, suddenly being told, "You can't say that. You can't wear that. You can't go there. You can't comment on that issue. You can't speak without approval. You can't post that photo. You can't use that word. You can't walk out without security. You can't take meetings spontaneously. You can't respond to the press. You can't defend yourself. You can't have your own voice." Thomas says Meghan was stunned. She didn't grow up in aristocracy. She didn't grow up with servants or titles or hierarchies. She grew up in the real world. She built her own world. So when she entered the royal family and realized personal freedom was no longer hers to define, Thomas believes the resentment began. Not hatred, resentment. A slow, tightening pressure. He says Meghan started to view royal protocol not as tradition, but as a cage. A beautifully decorated cage, but a cage nonetheless. And here's where the first major emotional contradiction emerges. Meghan admired the crown, but she hated the restrictions. She respected the symbolism, but resented the loss of control. She loved Harry, but struggled with the institution he belonged to. Thomas describes this tension as the emotional tug-of-war that shaped everything that followed. He says Meghan didn't show anger immediately. She wasn't impulsive. But he noticed, through small details, conversations, and expressions, that she was becoming increasingly uncomfortable being molded into something she wasn't. She had spent her entire life becoming Meghan Markle, and suddenly the world wanted her to become Princess Harry. Thomas recalls hearing from someone close to Meghan that she once said, "I didn't marry into a relationship. I married into an institution." But Meghan wasn't just losing autonomy. Thomas says she was losing identity. Her voice, her personality, her brand, her freedom to express who she was. And this loss wasn't abstract. It hit her in small, daily moments. For example, a simple walk outside required approval. An interview didn't belong to her. It belonged to the palace. Her activism wasn't hers to guide. It had to align with royal neutrality. Her opinions, the very things that fueled her career, had to be muted. Thomas believes Meghan felt something she had never experienced before: powerlessness. And this is where resentment began to grow roots. Thomas says Meghan wasn't the type of person to accept feeling powerless. She had fought for everything she had. She had worked for every opportunity. She had created her own identity. But royal life required surrendering all of that. And according to Thomas, she couldn't. She tried, publicly. She smiled. She adjusted. She played the role. She navigated the ceremonies, the tours, the obligations. But privately, Thomas says, she struggled. He heard from acquaintances, from people who communicated with her during those early months, that Meghan was becoming increasingly frustrated at being told she couldn't speak out, couldn't control her image, couldn't defend herself against unfair coverage. This wasn't the Hollywood system she understood. This wasn't a PR machine she could navigate. This was monarchy. A system older than any individual, any career, any modern brand. And Thomas says Meghan began challenging it. Not loudly, not publicly, but internally. She questioned why certain rules existed, why outdated traditions still governed modern families, why the monarchy insisted on neutrality when she had causes she felt passionate about, why she had to become a symbol instead of a person. Thomas claims Meghan expressed something that became the heart of her resentment. "They want me to disappear behind a title." And here's the emotional twist. Harry understood that fear, because Harry, too, had spent his life disappearing behind a title, behind his mother's tragedy, behind his brother's role, behind royal expectations. Meghan's frustration validated his own long-held bitterness. According to Thomas, this validation fused their emotional states together, and that fusion became dangerous. Because what Meghan hated, Harry had hated for years. What Meghan questioned, Harry had questioned in silence. What Meghan resented, Harry had resented without a voice. Thomas believes Meghan didn't ignite Harry's rebellion. She gave it permission. And once Harry felt morally justified in challenging the institution, the relationship between the couple and the monarchy began to decay. But Thomas says the real shift didn't emerge publicly. It emerged internally, in Meghan's changing behavior. He claims she became more assertive in questioning protocols, more frustrated with being silenced, more outspoken about how she felt constrained, more emotional about the pressure, more determined to keep her identity intact. There was one particular incident Thomas says he heard about that solidified his belief that Meghan's resentment had crossed a line. It happened in private. A conversation between Meghan and a senior royal figure, someone reminding her of protocol, someone insisting on tradition. Thomas says Meghan's reaction afterward, as described to him, was telling. She said she felt like a guest in someone else's house, but treated like an employee. That, Thomas believes, was the emotional spark that ignited the internal conflict. Because Meghan didn't want to be a royal accessory. She wanted to be a partner. She wanted to be equals with Harry. She wanted to be seen as a modern woman, not as a supporting character. But the monarchy wasn't built for that. Not then. Not now. And here's where the blueprint from earlier chapters meets the emotional tension of this one. Meghan had always been strategic, but strategy alone can be controlled. Resentment, however, is volatile. Thomas says the combination of Meghan's lifelong independence and the monarchy's rigid rules created a psychological clash she could never reconcile. Instead, it matured into resentment. Resentment toward the protocols. Resentment toward the restrictions. Resentment toward the media. Resentment toward the palace. And perhaps even resentment toward the expectations placed on her as Harry's wife. But the moment Thomas says truly crystallized Meghan's resentment, The moment he calls the escape phrase came during a conversation she supposedly had with a close friend. She said 6 words that Thomas believes became the backbone of Megxit. "I can't live like this forever." Those words weren't dramatic. They weren't loud. They weren't emotional. They were calm, certain, resolved. And Thomas insists that once she uttered those words, the path was set. Not publicly, not immediately, but internally. In that moment, Thomas believes Meghan realized something pivotal, something that would eventually shape history. The royal family would never bend enough to contain her, so she would have to break away. But the moment that pushed her from resentment into action, the moment that turned emotional discomfort into an actual plan, wasn't hers alone. It involved Harry. It involved pressure. It involved a breaking point inside the monarchy. And it exposed a fault line Thomas believes no one saw coming until it was too late. Here's the question that sits at the center of every royal documentary, every biography, every televised debate, and every whispered palace rumor. When did Harry change? Not publicly. That's easy to track. The world saw the shift after the marriage, after the press tension, after the emotional interviews. But privately, quietly, internally, when did Harry's identity begin to drift away from the monarchy that shaped him? When did the prince who had sworn duty, discipline, and loyalty begin speaking a new language, a language that sounded far less like the royal family and far more like Meghan Markle? This is the chapter Thomas Markle points to as the pivotal turning point. Not the drama, not the scandals, not the headlines, the language. Because when a person changes their vocabulary, they change their worldview. And when Harry began echoing Meghan's phrases, questions, tone, and frustrations, the royal family didn't just see a prince in love. They saw the beginning of a transformation they couldn't control. But before we dive into the turning point, we must begin with the mini-hook question that drives this entire chapter. What happens when someone who has spent his entire life silenced finally meets someone who encourages him to speak? Thomas says Meghan didn't just empathize with Harry's pain, she translated it. She gave him new words, new frameworks, new perspectives, new narratives that made sense of his lifelong emotional confusion. And Harry, for the first time, felt understood. Let's break down the layers of this shift. The mirror effect, how Meghan reflected Harry back to himself. Thomas believes Meghan played a key psychological role in Harry's transformation, not by manipulating him, but by mirroring him. She listened deeply. She validated his emotions. She affirmed the frustrations he had never voiced aloud. She reflected his pain back to him, but with new context. Harry's complaints, which he had once internalized, suddenly had an audience. And not just an audience, but an interpreter. Thomas claims Meghan helped Harry articulate truths he'd been holding inside for decades. And articulation is powerful. Pain unspoken is pain endured. Pain spoken is pain transformed. This, Thomas argues, is when the rift started accelerating. Not because Meghan told Harry what to think, but because she gave him permission to think it. Language shift number 1. I don't feel protected. Thomas heard. Through friends, press whispers, and private communication, that Harry began saying something unusual early in the relationship. I don't feel protected. This wasn't new. Harry had lived with that feeling since his mother's death. But he had never said it so openly. And he had certainly never said it with such certainty. Thomas believes Meghan was the one who helped him articulate that sentiment. Because Meghan herself felt unprotected, unshielded from the media, exposed to criticism. And when she expressed that to Harry, he saw his own childhood wounds through a new lens. Meghan wasn't just struggling. She was struggling in the same way his mother had. Whether Meghan intended it or not, Harry began to connect those dots emotionally. And once he did, his language changed. His tone changed. His sense of injustice became amplified. And this is where Thomas insists Meghan's voice and Harry's voice began merging. Language shift number 2. This isn't sustainable. Thomas heard that Meghan used this phrase often. She said it about the press, about protocol, about the workload, about the restrictions, about the lack of autonomy. She said it because she meant it. And soon enough, Harry began saying it too. When a single phrase turns from one partner's frustration into the couple's rallying cry, that's influence. That's emotional synergy. That's alignment. Thomas argues this shift signaled something deeper. Harry wasn't just agreeing with Meghan. He was internalizing her perspective. Language shift number 3. We deserve a life we control. This, Thomas believes, was the turning phrase, the one that marked the true beginning of Harry's departure from the monarchy. We deserve a life we control, not a life they tolerate, not a life they endure, not a life they perform, a life they control. According to Thomas, Meghan had spent years cultivating independence. She believed in self-governance, autonomy, and personal ownership over one's identity. She lived by those principles. Harry had never even considered such a possibility.